perfect example was the recent vote in the UN on the Hong Kong security law that was brought in, which saw 53 countries vote in support of China, and I believe about 27 opposed. Of those 53, very few of them will be rated as free or democratic countries, and the vast majority of them were recipients of Belt and Road Initiative funding and projects.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Intelligence Fusion's podcast. And this week we're talking about how China's extended its influence throughout the Asian continent. I'm Max Taylor and I'm the Senior Regional Analyst at Intelligence Fusion. And today I'm joined by Matt Pratton, who's worked closely with me in the East Asia region, particularly with the South China Sea.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers, Max. Yeah, of course. I'm one of a few analysts that we've been keeping a close eye on matters there. We go to great lengths to really drill down, incidents at the lowest level possible to get the best idea, clearest idea possible of what's going on in the whole area. So we look at where planes have where any info we can find on where planes have been flying, where ships have been sailing. Nearly everything we get to is the lowest level possible.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. And I'm also joined by Alex Smith, who's a new starter at Intelligence Fusion. And Alex has spent some time living in Hong Kong, I believe.
Yeah, I used to live and work in Hong Kong, and I've had a long-term interest in China and sort of East Asia and Southeast Asia more generally.
I think it's safe to say you've got quite extensive experience in the Asia-Pacific region as an analyst as well.
Yes, I've spent my career covering the whole sort of Pakistan to Australia region.
Great stuff. So, as I said, this week we're talking about the growing influence of China in the Asia region and how they've done this. And this is a massive subject, as we've already mentioned in the past. This is huge. So we've tried to break this down into two distinct categories. And the first we're going to focus on is a more military side of things and the way that they've extended using military and hard power. And we're also going to look at the economic side of China's growing influence through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and more specifically CPEC, or the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So, Matt, would you like to get us started talking about the South China Sea and the military side of this question?
Where to begin? I think I could probably sum up the South China Sea's significance as, in terms of maritime trade and resources, you could probably call it decisive terrain. I mean, that's by comparison to, say, the Pacific Ocean. That small body of water, the South China Sea. It's you've got quite a number of nations that depend on that area for access to and from other nations around the world. I mean, just to rattle off probably a few nations off the top of my head that would depend on access through to and from that area. I mean, you've got the Chinese themselves, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam, and then of course with surrounding nations around the world, that particular area as well is vital for them to access those particular markets for trade. And in terms of resources in the area, well, the South China Sea is regarded as having a considerable amount of fishing stock of resources for fishing, which in Asia, Southeast Asia and East Asia, fishing is quite a considerably large consumer market. So that particular body of water, being able to access and have freedom of movement in that area, can provide quite a lot of security in terms of supply, in terms of supply for fishing stocks, which of course will enable fishing markets around those areas to keep operating. And finally, there's reportedly quite a lot of energy resources in terms of oil and gas. So controlling that bit of area in terms of the energy resources available can help provide anyone who of course every nation around the world needs to guarantee its energy supplies. So having a considerable amount of control in that area can for any nation in the immediate region, well, that can provide quite a lot of security for energy.
And let's not forget that from a purely military perspective as well, the South China Sea really does add several hundred miles of effectively defense in depth, and allows, it gives China the ability to push its homeland defense far beyond its coastline, which is another motivating factor.
Yeah, I think it's maybe less a publicized point that as well, actually. And also from China's perspective, it is of some concern from a security perspective to have these US military assets as well as US allied military assets in the region. So from a Chinese perspective as well, it's easy to see sort of why they respond as they do to these troop movements and drills that we see in the region.
Yeah, I mean, for just about not just the Chinese, for that the South China Sea, like you guys mentioned, with regards to defense in depth, it would provide a really effective, having freedom of movement and freedom of action in that area can essentially provide, in military terms, a very effective buffer for, well, not just the Chinese, but for anyone in the area. So Vietnam, for example, having freedom of action and freedom of movement in the South China Sea is going to be one very effective way to make sure that should anyone try to come into Vietnam with a hostile intent, they've got an effective buffer to provide early warning. And the same would go for Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and all the other neighbors in the area. So there's quite a number of countries, both in the immediate region and in the wider, well, in fact, around the world, that would rely on being able to have freedom of movement and freedom of action in the area.
So you hear, I think when people look at the South China Sea as well, they often see it in the context of USA versus China as a confrontation between those two. But I think it's quite easy to forget that there's other countries in the area, in the region as well. How have you guys seen other countries in the region reacting? Have they largely bandwagoned with China, or have they, in cases, tried to oppose Chinese influence?
It depends. I mean, for those who are sort of taking a sort of pro-China stance, probably the most striking example of that would be the Philippines. In fact, they, from essentially President Rodrigo Duterte is pretty much, allowing the Chinese into the Philippines' exclusive economic zones, frankly, which is very good news for China, but of course for everyone else around the region, that's quite concerning. Taiwan depends on being able to have a lot of freedom of movement because, well, since the very start of communist China, as soon as mainland China was taken over by the Communist Party, Taiwan suddenly realized that they now have a very existential threat to their security. So as far as other nations go, Vietnam, now, while a communist country, are actually quite concerned about Chinese actions in the South China Sea because, with regards to the fishing stocks that the body of water provides, the Chinese Coast Guards have on a number of occasions this year actually rammed Vietnamese fishing vessels. And so, of course, having that kind of threat to simply commercial fishing is quite a concern for any nation. So while you'd sort of in some cases you'd sort of expect Vietnam to sort of go along with China, given the both countries are communist regimes, but not really the case. And for Malaysia's become, from what I can tell, Malaysia's quite concerned because a lot of Chinese survey vessels have been getting very close to their waters. Likewise for Indonesia. So Philippines seems to be sort of cozying up to the Chinese a lot more and ceding territory to them in the South China Sea. Other nations are not so friendly. They're actually quite concerned with what's been going on there.
It's a good point you make. Vietnam's actually quite an interesting case because they have a lot of despite the prima facie sort of communist link. They've got historical tensions with China going back centuries. But on the issue of the South China Sea, China exerts its influence not so much military, as you say, Coast Guard, but they also have their sort of fishermen militias who are very active day in, day out in observation of other nations' fishing ships and getting involved with that. They often are the people reporting back to the Coast Guard on, it could be US ship movements, but also just fishing ships from other nations. Vietnam have to an extent emulated that, not on such a scale, but Vietnam also is quite active in using its Coast Guard and its sort of militias as an attempt to sort of actively push back against China. And of course, one we didn't mention is Indonesia, which is another big regional sort of player. and there've been quite a number of, like with Vietnam, Chinese coast guards ramming and sinking fishing ships there. So while individually a lot of these countries aren't really geared up to push back against someone as big and organized as China, China's pushing on quite a few fronts against resistance.
Yeah, and actually, it's a very interesting point you made. So that just sort of at the end there about a lot of nations not sort of being kind of sort of unprepared to sort of match the aggression, which it's certainly becoming a scenario, I reckon, where a lot of nations in that region certainly need to I suppose, for lack of a better term, get their affairs in order, because with the major consideration with major concern with the South China Sea is the fact that the Chinese have actually been establishing bases on reefs and islands in the region. I mean, the Paracel Islands, that's right on Vietnam's doorstep. That's pretty much, from what I can tell, become a very well-established military base. In fact, with a lot of incidents we've been plotting in the South China Sea. Almost on a weekly basis, we're coming across incidents of Chinese bombers landing on the Paracel Islands, Chinese fighters landing in the Paracel Islands. Also, activity in the near the Spratly Islands. It's quite concerning that, and of course, alongside all those aircraft, a whole lot of ships as well. So. The Coast Guard vessels, they've been causing a lot of concern for fishermen, coming from Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. While that's occurring, there's a whole lot of military activity. Essentially, the Chinese have turned within the last about 5 years. The Chinese military have turned those islands into well-functioning bases, which essentially provide a very good buffer. For early warning and, like you said, defense in depth.
I mean, China's not the only country that did that. Vietnam has, and certainly Vietnam has laid claim to certain islands. They have military, the Philippines, although they've given up a lot, as you say, they've given up territory. Philippines, a number of other nations have also tried to, build outposts and do a certain amount of land reclamation, but none of them have got the capacity to do it on anything like the scale that China's been doing.
Although, not on the same scale, but the efforts certainly. Although I think Taiwan's an exception to that. In fact, wasn't myself and one of the other regional analysts we came across incident last week of Taiwan sending about it was about a company of Marines to I can't remember the name of the island.
Pratas Islands, was it?
Yes, that's the one. So they've sent about a company of Marines to that island because they were quite concerned about a major exercise that the Chinese have been doing nearby. And in fact, with regards to the military activity, probably I think it possibly could become a bit more significant as we sort of look elsewhere with regards to Chinese influence is when you look at what they've been up to around the world. I think the major concern about the South China Sea is that what the Chinese have been up to in the South China Sea is essentially a manifestation of everything else they've been up to elsewhere. I mean, take for example with all the aircraft and the ships that they've been sending out. Really good example actually was about 2008, 2009. I distinctly remember reading an article in a paper about how Lockheed Martin, major US defense contractor, their computer systems were hacked and terabytes of data were stolen on the F-35 program and possibly on the F-22 Raptor as well. Now, both those aircraft are essentially they're stealth fighters and they're multi-role aircraft, so they can conduct air-to-air attack, air-to-ground support, electronic warfare, intelligence gathering. Both platforms are very, very impressive pieces of aircraft. And after that incident, there was actually about 5 years down the track where the Chinese actually unveiled their fifth generation multi-role air superiority fighter called the J-20. And when they unveiled it, it was quite a concerning coincidence that the J-20 looks very, very similar to an F-22 and an F-35.
Yeah, I think just looking at a few images of it, there's pretty clear resemblances, isn't there?
So,
certainly. So I think in the interest of time, we'll sort of move on from the South China Sea. But I think one thing we can summarize from it is the country, the USA and China are obviously very much engaged in confrontation, but I think the regional countries such as Vietnam and Indonesia, which we've mentioned, and the Philippines, they've been forced to be much more pragmatic, and they've tried to sort of almost tread the line between the two and balance the two against each other at times, or perhaps bandwagon or oppose at other times.
Although I think there's possibly a risk in doing that if they try and sort of play be too diplomatic in that regard. I mean, one of the things for certain, the China's actions in the South China Sea have actually been quite concerning. If they at the same time, if they're going to engage in a lot of diplomacy and try and sort of keep things civil, that could actually distract them from building up a lot of hard power assets to make sure they're covered just in case diplomacy fails. I mean, I think if there's one lesson to be learned from the South China Sea is the good old concept that's been in place since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. You've got to make sure, as a state, you've got to make sure that you can guarantee your own interests, be it through soft power and certainly through hard power. So I think what's been happening could be quite a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of nations there to, not just try and stay friendly, but in case things do go bad, they can take a hardline approach.
So from a more economic perspective then, moving away from this more military approach, we've seen, I think that it's impossible to talk about Chinese influence without talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a major infrastructure, a series of infrastructure projects across the world, which China intends to link itself with other markets such as the EU, as well as others. And this project has seen China gaining influence in multiple countries through investment and other projects. So Alex, I know this is something you know quite a bit about. I was wondering if there's anything you can tell us about this.
Well, first off, I mean, you have to understand that the Belt and Road Initiative is a truly vast project. Projections on how much China are actually spending on it see it at over $1 trillion by, I believe, 2027. I think Morgan Stanley have it like 1.3 trillion dollars. So in terms of scale, there's really nothing else that you can even compare it to. And you're right. It serves a number of functions. It serves as an outlet for Chinese investment, for raw materials, for their manufacturing, for labor. But it also, and like you say, it opens up markets to link China to European markets, to energy sources in Central Asia that can't be disrupted by US military. Would that be the case? Unlike in the South China Sea. And it's also, from an influence perspective, all of this money, all of this needed investment, especially in developing countries, Southeast Asia and Southeast Central Asia especially, really is like a vehicle for Chinese economic influence, especially in cases of the poorer developing nations that really badly need infrastructure. It's a way of bringing them very much into the Chinese orbit. It has been criticised as what's known as debt trap diplomacy, which is a fair point. There are some nations where 20% of their GDP is now debt to China. You get some big projects like CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor is probably the biggest Belt and Road Initiative going. But along with all this, there comes local resentment and pushback, both political and from populations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. So we hear a lot about the successes of Belt and Road, but I do think now's a good time to talk about where there has been pushback. And in Pakistan, actually, the CPEC corridor, which you mentioned earlier, that's where one of the few cases where there's actually been armed pushback to Chinese influence. And this has mostly come through the form of Balochistan's various militant groups. But the biggest and most active of these is the Balochistan Liberation Army. And this group has carried out attacks against Chinese assets in the past and actually quite recently at the Karachi Stock Exchange. And they targeted the Karachi Stock Exchange following a deal which saw a Chinese consortium purchase quite a large share in the stock exchange itself. And that's why they targeted it. And that featured in the BLA's discourse following the attack on their official channels. And they've also targeted workers from these Chinese projects working in the Balochistan region itself. So this is a case of where there has been violent opposition to this, and they're very aware of the fact that the Chinese-funded projects also mean Chinese influence within Balochistan. And less violent we've seen in Central Asia, which is an example you brought up earlier. Central Asia is seen a few social protests among the populace of the area who have generally disliked the way that a lot of these investment projects have actually brought very little social development, which they've been advertised as bringing to the host regions. So the reasons for this are varied. So in Central Asia, there's chronic corruption at the governmental level, and this has really reduced the amount of development that we're seeing. And also, a lot of the workers on these projects are actually taken from China. So not necessarily all of them. They do still recruit locally as well. But in many cases, the majority of the workers have been foreign workers, or at least not from the region itself. They've been taken from elsewhere. And this is, as you would expect, caused quite significant resentment as communities see essentially their jobs being taken away, and people who aren't even from the area taking jobs that they expected they would take themselves. But again, I think it is important here to talk about how much of a hindrance is this. We've talked about pushback among social populations, but then in places like Central Asia, most of these countries are limited democracies at best, or in the case of Turkmenistan, outright dictatorships. So in countries where protest is very limited, which is admittedly the majority of the countries where Belt and Road is going through at the moment, social protest is so heavily suppressed. There's an element of what potential does it have to actually impact the Belt and Road Initiative? And currently, I think it is actually quite limited, with the protests being quite small and often quite infrequent. And yes, they have flared up in places like Kazakhstan in the past, but generally they've been small, and the government's been able to largely push them aside, or at least just give them very little media coverage.
No, I'd agree with that. I think probably a greater threat to many of the Belt and Road projects would probably be them being cancelled as examples emerge where a project has been used has got a government into trouble fiscally, as has happened in Sri Lanka, for example. I think participants in the Belt and Road are a lot more reticent now than they perhaps were to sign up, because you've got to remember these aren't even like aid loans. These are these aren't aid gifts. This isn't free money that China's giving away. It's just low interest loans. They do have to be paid back, and a lot of projects that maybe when at the beginning people were signing up for, they're now viewed as not as financially viable, and China's reined in its spending a little and being more selective. On the political level, there's been cancellations when Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia was elected in 2018. He cancelled about 22 billions worth of Belt and Road Initiative loans because he just didn't see it as being a viable thing for his country. And I think we could see more of that.
I think it's certainly a good point, actually. I think people are now starting to realise that this is a potential threat. Yeah. And whilst, again, back to CPEC, whilst Pakistan is a very close ally of China and sees China as a great counterweight against their neighbour India, CPEC presents a problem for Pakistan in that the attacks on Chinese assets have raised questions, and whilst I think it's unlikely for the time being, it has raised questions as to whether China is going to have to become more involved in the security of these projects. Because at the moment, they've very much taken an approach of, we'll just leave you to it. We'll give you the investment as long as you pay us back. We'll leave you to it, and we won't question your practices. Whereas in Pakistan, there have been cases where they've requested the Pakistani government to provide better security. And I imagine China would be very reluctant to deploy any form of security forces personnel to the Balochistan region. I think they must be aware that this would only make it worse. But if attacks were to increase and continue, or protests in other regions are to intensify, then yes, I think that we're going to start seeing a security threat. And I think that will then finally start actually having quite a very negative impact on these initiatives, at the same time as governments are already starting to question, hold on, is this a good idea? Is this the best solution for me? So I think China is also, I do think the initiative is so far largely successful. I do think China is at the moment starting to realise, okay, there is issues with this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Project. Yeah, I kind of wonder what sort of scenario you could envision where China gets sucked into sort of foreign adventurism, which traditionally it doesn't get involved in it. I mean, but as we've said, it's particularly its naval forces build up, it gets that expeditionary capability. It has these large interests in foreign countries. Yeah, you're right. I could see some, as it's so-called wolf warrior, sort of situations arising in the medium to long term.
It'd certainly be a very difficult trap to avoid. I mean, just to what you're mentioning about the sort of what you guys were mentioning about the sort of the scale of the Belt and Road Initiative. I can certainly back you guys up on that one. I mean, back to when I was my apologies, possibly a bit of ancient history here, but when I was in the Australian Army, I deployed to East Timor for 6 months back in 2012, and there was a few occasions I went to Papua New Guinea after that as well. And in both countries, no word of a lie, you could throw a rock in any direction and you would hit at least 5 infrastructure projects or any kind of construction project that was being heavily backed by the Chinese government. In a lot of cases, the construction signs, all the safety signs were all in all in Chinese. So that's of course a very that would mean, of course, there's quite a sizable workforce in just those two small places, small countries alone. And of course, that does, in Papua New Guinea, there's, of course, there can be a lot of tension amongst locals and foreigners when it comes to infrastructure projects, particularly mining. And consequently, I think it's going to be sort of a bit of a very difficult trap to avoid, because with all those Belt and Road Initiative projects going on, cancelled or not, there's still quite a considerable amount going on. That's a lot of workers coming from mainland China and going into those areas. In fact, there's even been cases of that in Australia with infrastructure projects, and that's caused quite a bit of concern. So as sort of tension increases, and say areas such as East Timor, Papua New Guinea, or much more still developing countries, as the tension increases, they'll probably have to at some point send security forces in, and that's going to it'll have to be a sizable commitment, because there's just so many projects going on. But as they do that, that's going to probably unintentionally make matters worse, because there's going to be, of course, with a lot of security forces, that's going to increase even more tension. You may even see, very, very worst case scenario in sort of kind of insurgency movements emerge. But I'd say that's a very, very extreme and very unlikely scenario at the moment, but a possibility to consider.
I guess that's one of the strengths of the Belt and Road being so extensive as well, as if there was to be tension, I assume the Chinese government is very reluctant to become involved. So if there was to be overwhelming tensions in a country, that it's taking place, it's such a global outreach that they can just ditch projects in one area and just rely on projects from another country, etc.
Yeah, of course. We've reached a stage now where the Belt and Road Initiative is actually paying significant dividends on a diplomatic level for China. The perfect example was the recent vote in the UN on the Hong Kong security law that was brought in, which saw 53 countries vote in support of China, and I believe about 27 opposed. Of those 53, very few of them will be rated as free or democratic countries, and the vast majority of them were recipients of Belt and Road Initiative funding and projects. Many of the African nations that voted with China were actually in the process of trying to restructure their Belt and Road Initiative debt that they've got to China. So it really shows how that economic clout can be wielded at a very high diplomatic level.
Absolutely. So I think that's all we've got, finishing on that note today. So thanks both Matt and Alex for today. I think that was really good. Actually, it's been pretty comprehensive. If you liked what you saw, then please feel free to like us on social media, and by all means follow us on the YouTube channel as well. And we will see you next fortnight.